So let's welcome Kathy Grieb.
It's a generous group. You haven't even heard it yet. I want to begin with a personal word of thanks to Ellen Johnson and Bill Roberts for inviting me to give this paper, which has led me to an interesting set of reflections, which I hope will be useful for you as well. How's the mic? Can you all hear me fine? Okay, good. I graduated from Virginia Theological Seminary in 1983 when the new hymnal was almost out. I think it was 1985, right? But we had lots of hints about, because of Ray Glover, about what was coming, and lots of excitement about it. And a lot has happened in theology since then. I won't be able to cover that waterfront. I'll just be able to point to a few things. When I was a student at VTS, one of our theology professors, David Scott, assured us that we would not have to worry about learning either liberation theology or feminist theology, because these were just passing fads that would quickly disappear. We should instead focus our attention on traditional theology, which would, like Jesus Christ, be the same yesterday, today, and forever. He could not have been more mistaken. As a feminist who was also interested in what was happening in Latin American politics and Roman Catholic theologians there, I was skeptical, although I did not yet know what a hermeneutic of suspicion was. Apparently, I already had one. When I got to Yale at the end of the 80s and the start of the 90s for my doctoral studies in theology, the importance of Hans Frey's The Eclipse of Biblical Narrative was gradually being recognized, and Yale was something of a theological mecca for people interested in something called narrative theology and something called hermeneutics, a 50-cent word for the interpretation of texts. Hans Frey was personally wary of putting any adjective in front of the word theology. And though it was clear to scholars at Harvard and at Chicago that there was a Yale School of Theology, Hans Frey, George Lindbeck, David Kelsey, Brevard Childs, who were supposed to be the Yale School, didn't recognize or want any such thing. But clearly, the Bible was at the center of it all. And there was tremendous interest, both in biblical interpretation and in how various interpretations of Scripture were impacted by denominational lenses and social locations. In other words, nobody much listened to Frey's warning about putting adjectives in front of the word theology, and there was a celebration and a proliferation of adjectives. Black theology from James Cone and others, feminist theologies from Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, Phyllis Tribble, Letty Russell, and others, womanist theologies from Jackie Grant and Kelly Brown Douglas and others, biblical theology, narrative theology, liberation theologies, radical orthodoxy from John Milbank and others, queer theology just emerging, and a whole range of contextual theologies, Asian, African, European, Australia, South American, indigenous theologies of First Nations people, Aborigines, Maori, Native Americans. Contextual theologies inevitably led to conversations about both language and power. In the areas of most interest to me, theology and biblical studies, this led to a huge argument about how to name God, or even whether to name God, since much of Judaism declines to pronounce the four-letter tetragrammaton, holy name of God that is not to be vocalized by observant Jews. When the first Jerusalem Bible came out, and this is also true of our 1979 prayer book, it was common for Christians to say this name of God when reciting Psalms and elsewhere, but when Jewish scholars like John Levinson at Harvard, who says it's the only four-letter word he never uses, wondered, when they wondered aloud about Christians who rushed in where Jews feared to tread, a lot of us began to rethink our practice and to see it as a kind of Christian arrogance, as if we were closer to God and could use God's personal familiar name when Judaism could or would not. At the same time, feminist theologians were questioning, and still are. I got in here in time for the language session. I was really wanting to make sure that happened. Feminist theologians were questioning the construal of God as male. Rosemary Ruther famously said, if God is male, then the male is God. While feminist biblical scholars were uncovering lots of feminine imagery in the Bible about God, especially about the wisdom of God. And feminist church historians were retrieving French and German medieval mystics like Hildegard of Bingen and English mystics like Julian of Norwich, who were quite comfortable speaking about all three members of the Trinity in terms that were more creatively gendered. Sarah Coakley is an example of an Anglican theologian who has rethought much of patristic theology with attention to some of the more recent thinking about the social construction of gender. God has many names indeed. Questions about power, right and wrong uses of power, whether it is wise to describe God as almighty, as having all power or having all the power, have also preoccupied theologians. The whole field of political theology is new since 1982, as are questions about how economic theories intersect with economic doctrines of the Trinity, for example. Archbishop Desmond Tutu in South Africa, in the context of apartheid, and Alan Bosak from the Reformed tradition, did important work on the relationship of love and power, justice and power, wealth or poverty and power. In our own context, Catherine Tanner has written a number of important books exploring economic metaphors for a doctrine of the atonement. More about that at the end of my talk. God as giver, God as gift, God as the one who calls forth gifts from us to be given to one another. So atonement and understanding Christian vocation and the Christian ethical life. Theological explorations about power and the misuses of power by humans and by God also raised questions about abuses of church authority and helped to shape conversations about creating safe churches, safe for children, safe for women, safe for the elderly or disabled. The Episcopal Church and the Anglican Communion were at the same time also thinking a lot about power struggles as played out in lawsuits, and how to deal with a diversity of theological opinion. I might just comment that we haven't gotten very far on this issue. 2 years ago, I was removed from the Unity, Faith, and Order Commission of the Anglican Communion because the Episcopal Church had approved same-sex marriages. And in a very recent primates meeting, the same thing has just happened to representatives of the Scottish Episcopal Church for the same reason. I would say that's a real lack of imagination at that level, only one move, and an inability to admit the truth that not all Anglicans, just as not all Presbyterians, not all Lutherans, not all Methodists are in agreement about these matters, and that we need to say that to our ecumenical partners as well as to ourselves. There really is more than one point of view when we're talking about theological and ethical matters with our ecumenical partners, and that's a theological issue within itself. The theology of Archbishop Rowan Williams has been characterized by self-critical reflection and creative questioning. More question marks for theologians than exclamation points. Both Rowan Williams and Sarah Coakley could be described as appreciative of the richness and diversity of our Christian theological tradition, not cynical, but skeptical of what we all know is true and what must be defended at any cost. Archbishop Justin Welby has made reconciliation the center of his theological vision with some success, especially at first. Again, all the primates attended the meeting before this last one, but this time Nigeria, Rwanda, and Uganda did not come. They conscientiously objected to the presence of the United States and the Scottish Episcopal Church. But it's not just about same sexuality, whether marriages or ordination, but still about women, and the perception also that the West, especially the UK and the US, are running the communion. We could use a category of hymns on the theology of communion. We could also use hymns that celebrate ecumenical and interfaith diversity. We now have a Muslim visiting scholar on our faculty, in addition to Rabbi Jack Moline, who teaches Judaism and also Midrash. One of our faculty members is actively in Christian-Buddhist dialogue, and there's considerable interest among the faculty more than among our students, many of whom are very anxious to show how Anglican and Orthodox they are while they're in the ordination process. I can understand that. I was there. It's just a new kind of discussion that happens. And that brings me to Judaism. In the last decade, we have seen several important statements at a very high level from Rome, from the Lutheran Worldwide Federation, from others, apologizing for complicity, wittingly, unwittingly, in the Holocaust, the Tremendum, the Shoah, that killed 6 million Jews, and of course, many others as well, but 6 million Jews. This is a result in part of active theological discussions about Jewish-Christian relations and what may or must be said and what must not be said theologically. There are some extreme views. Rosemary Ruther in Faith and Fratricide argued that all Christology is inherently supersessionist, it's replacement oriented, it's inherently anti-Jewish, it's inherently anti-Semitic. I might want to just comment on those terms for a minute, because you know that anti-Semitic is a 19th century term that has more to do with race, and anti-Jewish is an earlier issue that has to do more with theology. The idea of supersessionism is to sit on top of, squash down, and therefore replace. Lots of questions about the New Testament have arisen around this problematic, especially around the Gospels of Matthew and John, and especially, I might say, during Matthew liturgical year, when we hear Matthew's Passion narrative at the beginning of Holy Week and John's Passion narrative at the end of Holy Week. But also questions about Paul, who is seen by many Jewish scholars as an apostate from Judaism. Hymns like My Song is Love Unknown, I know so many people for whom that's one of their very favorite hymns, and Lord of the Dance have not helped in this regard. They did this to my Lord. I danced for the Temple and the Pharisee, but they would not dance and they would not say with me. They have not been helpful. Not to mention a children's hymn that I heard sung in I won't mention what denomination it was. It wasn't any denomination represented here. It goes like, I heard this sung by kids. They were teaching the kids to sing this. I just want to be a sheep. 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 It's fun for the kids to sing that. I don't want to be a Pharisee. I don't want to be a Pharisee. I don't want to be a Pharisee because they're not fair, you see. I don't want to be a Sadducee. I don't want to be a Sadducee. I don't want to be a Sadducee because they're so sad, you see. I'm just going, oh, this makes me want to cry to think about kids being indoctrinated into that kind of thinking before they even know what the words mean. Another important theological discussion is the one about Christian appropriation of Judaism, as in Christian Passover celebrations, and of course, Jews for Jesus type groups. And of course, the complicated question about appropriation is not only raised in biblical studies about how to understand the relationship between the two testaments, it's also raised by African Americans, Native Americans, and others. Jacqueline Grant's important book, White Woman's Christ, Black Woman's Jesus, and Kelly Brown Douglas's book, The Black Christ, have dealt with some of these questions. And the African American tradition is especially complicated for those of us who are colorless because of the tensions between Saturday night music and Sunday morning music. In Memphis last year, I gave a paper on why the blues is not the devil's music. I don't think the devil likes any kind of music. And Judy Fentress-Williams teaches a course here on Psalms and spirituals in dialogue with James Cone and others. So I think we need some hymns that carefully help to make some of these connections. I would just flag another language issue. Levis is the hardest hymnal to use on the question of inclusive language. So how can we honor this important tradition and also work towards language about God and about people that is both truthful and kind and more reflective about diverse opinions about both theology and anthropology? An issue like this was also raised for me with one of the hymns. I think it's from Wonder, Love, and Praise. I was trying to look for it. I remembered it on the plane, and of course I didn't have time to find it. It comes from one of the African nations, and I know Africa is a big place. I should know where it comes from, but I don't. If you believe and I believe and we together pray, the Holy Spirit must come down and something or other, chase our blues away. I don't know, something that rhymes. But the Holy Spirit is God and must have to do anything for some of us. That's not prayer at that point, that's something else. And so again, how to take great hymn traditions and honor their origins and their sources, and to what extent is it okay to change them? I was hearing echoes of this question in another form in the language section earlier. Of course, the same thing is true for Richard Wilbur's lovely poem, A Stable Lamp is Lighted, where it's a reference to men. It's the end of a rhyme line, one of the things you don't mess with, but it's too bad. I think the same theological and ethical issue shows up again with respect to Flor y Canto and other Spanish music, but in a different form. Here, the traditions, or at least the evangelical Pentecostal part of it, has, like praise music, given us a lot of joyful, enthusiastic, upbeat songs like Alabare, but not so many hymns about pain or fear of deportation or sorrows of any kind. They could use some blues. Our students, by the way, are picking up ideas related to that branch of theology that is ecclesiology, doctrine of the church. And so in part, teaching is also learning. There's that wonderful prayer for those who teach and those who learn, and I keep hoping they're the same people. So when they're all excited about the new monasticism, we pay attention because it affects us as well. And they like Byrd and Palestrina and Tallis and Gibbons, and they like holy smoke, and they like candles, and they like dark churches, and they like retrieval of older liturgies, both East and West. The more evangelical groups are really interested in church planting and unapologetic mission strategies, chastened, of course, by 19th century empire theological mistakes, but eager to find other ways. Missional Voices conferences draw huge numbers of people under 30s with theological revision. There's an interest, for example, in reverse mission. There are several different ways that this term is used. One is going somewhere far away, not to teach and change others, but to learn and bless what God is already doing there way before we got there. Another is receiving missionaries to help reform us. In the UK and the US especially, paying to bring missionaries from other parts of the world to tell us things we need to hear about how we're perceived, how our churches are perceived, and to learn about what's exciting them and where God is being glorified in their churches. Theologies about migration, immigration, strangers are, of course, springing up in response to world situations almost everywhere. And it's another area where we need more theological reflection, and some of that may happen in hymn texts. There's also, because of the way the world is, a tremendous interest in conflict. There's a real frustration with lawsuits and the amount of money wasted on lawsuits. I'm in that camp. When I think about what could have been done with all of that money, it makes me sick. So not conflict management in the sense of managing how the conflict goes, but conflict reduction, conflict resolution, skills and strategies for avoiding conflicts in the first place. And then once there is a conflict, for limiting conflicts and for guiding people in recovering from conflict, a conflict as trauma, all those sorts of issues. Two more things that I want to tag, and you'll laugh when I want to mention Harry Potter. But it's 20 years now that the Harry Potter series has been with us, and a multitude of books on the Christianity of Harry Potter, or the theology found in Harry Potter. I'm not really interested in that, but I'm more interested in how those books and the films and the theme parks and the organizations, the social justice organizations founded that call themselves Harry Potter for Haiti or something like that, have shaped a generation. Of course, some other things have changed too. Our reactions to the words witch, wizard, and magic have changed. New words have come into our dictionary like muggles and no-mages. But because of J.K. Rowling's particular vision and the way she has shaped her characters and the impact they have had, some other things have happened along the way that are worth, I think, mentioning in a discussion of theological changes. People have been encouraged to be more empathetic, to be more interested in questions of fairness and justice, more interested in who is or is not included, and more likely to have a greater awareness of the complexity of life and the real presence and power of evil and the difficulty of discerning good and evil. These books do not have characters with white hats and black hats. They're not like Westerns. That's much more subtle. And they are really prompting a number of service organizations that are sending aid and relief to places that need it, based on ethical and I would say theological convictions that have come out of this series. It's just really an interesting phenomenon. I promised to get back to atonement. I'm leaving it for last because it's, I think, the hardest one. The church, as you know, has wisely never required adherence to any particular doctrine of the atonement. The mystery of what happened within the Trinity and between God and humanity on the cross, on Holy Saturday, whatever you think, for some people it's a day of rest, for others it's a day of descent into in hell, a smashing of the gates and bars of hell. On Resurrection Sunday, all of that great Triduum. The mystery of what happened there is just that. It's a mystery. It is an event at the very heart of God. You might say it is a party to which we are cordially not invited, because it's nothing we can help with. It's done for us, but really we have nothing to offer in that department. But some particular versions of the atonement have become highly problematic, especially the idea of sacrifice. That is, as it's tied particularly to ransom, money paid to God, money paid to the devil, and as it's tied to violence, bloodletting, Rene Girard, the idea of the scapegoat. There are parts of the church that feel strongly, for example, that Genesis 22, the Akedah, the near sacrifice of Isaac, should not be read aloud in churches. It should not get airtime because it's an example of divine child abuse. The same sort of logic is also applied to sacrifice language about the death of Jesus. There's a movement in EOW texts and elsewhere to move away from sacrifice language in Eucharistic prayers to talk about Jesus Christ as a pleasing aroma or an example of faithfulness, and avoid the notion of the death on the cross as any kind of sacrifice. There are some reasons for this, I think. One is the use of sacrifice metaphors by the military. Another is the Mel Gibson film about the Passion with all of that blood. And then the questions about the morality of torture by the CIA and others. All of these things have been swirling around. But of course, the description of the death of Jesus as a sacrifice is very old. It's one of the oldest theologies we have. It's even older than Paul. Paul refers to Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us keep the celebration in the Corinthian correspondence. And he's referring to something that's they already know. Just as he doesn't have to explain what baptism is, he doesn't have to explain what Eucharist is. He has to explain to the churches why their current practices don't fit with the sacraments that they're meant to be expounding in their lives. But the idea of sacrifice is already there. It's really amazing when you think about it. I still sort of haven't gotten over this, even though I've been teaching it for a number of years. Jesus died about the most unclean, horrible way a Jewish male could die. Outside of the holy city of Jerusalem, next to the garbage dump, on a hill littered with skulls, not just in the shape of a skull, but with real live skulls around it, because that's where people were killed by pagan Roman soldiers in a long tortured death. But within 20 years, from 30 to the 50s, when Paul is writing his letters, but within that space of time, already the earliest Christian theologians had redescribed that death in terms of sacrifice, so that most unholy death was redescribed as an offering to God, as a sacrifice of atonement, and as an example of liturgical faithfulness as well. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what you all as hymn writers and musicians should do with that either. But I flag it as one of the most things that is left hanging and unresolved in theological discussions. Thank you so much.
We got a question earlier. We got a question earlier in the day that I think would go with your talk, as I can't remember when it came in. And if anybody else has questions, let us know. We'll pick those up. This says, in high school, our daughter was tasked to write an essay on the doctrine of the Episcopal Church. Upon doing her research, her finding, and confirmed by a priest, was that was no or almost no doctrine. How do we define what we believe as a church in the absence of a historic body and ongoing development of Episcopal theology?
That's a great question. And I'm not sure that I buy the premise entirely. That is, I do think we have doctrine. I've heard this as well. That often from incoming students, which means it's being said in the churches that are sending them, that there's no doctrine, or there's minimal doctrine in the Episcopal Church. And it's true that we don't, our part of the Anglican Communion has never required subscription to the 39 Articles of Religion, and we don't have the Augsburg Confession or the Westminster Confession as a core document. We don't have something like that. And so with Lionel Mitchell and others, we say that praying shapes believing, and that we sing and say our doctrine in our liturgy. And I think, and so that our when people want to know what we believe, they open the prayer book and they open the hymnal. Our hymn texts have to be approved by General Convention. I'm saying stuff you all know, have to be approved by General Convention twice, just as the prayer book does. So so that means that we care all the houses, the House of Bishops, and the House of Laity. And the do we have three houses? I'm sorry, a little jet lagged at the moment. Deputies, House of Deputies, which are both clergy and laity, thank you, have to sign off on them in terms of doctrine. So it's not that we don't have any doctrine or don't care about doctrine. Somewhat part of it is a question of where you start our history. I like to start it at 597 and not with Henry VIII. And that's because I think that Gregory the Great of Gregorian chant fame sent Augustine and about 40 monks from Rome to England, not angles, but angels, that they needed to hear the gospel, and carried with them the Bible that is now in the Canterbury Gospel, the Gospels that are now in Cambridge, and brought out whenever we install a new Archbishop of Canterbury. They're in some kind of armored car, and journey to Canterbury, do the rite, and journey back to Cambridge. We have, so that tradition and the tradition of the pallium, that is that sheep's wool thing that is a sign of representing the Pope. That is on the shield of Canterbury and others, it means to connect us, Anglicanism, Anglican Christianity, with that doctrinal center of the time. Now I know that there was a Reformation, and I know this is and especially I know that this year it's 500. Birthday, but I remember being embarrassed in Sunday school when my friends at school and I would talk, and not on a very high theological level, and they would talk about their heroes, John Calvin, Martin Luther, John Wesley. They didn't know about Charles Wesley, they should have, but John Wesley, and I was supposed to talk about Henry VIII. So it was anyway. We've always had doctrine, and we've had shifts in doctrine, like every other denomination that went through the Reformation. We have been, after the Reformation, I think a lot of people were less excited about the idea that if your understanding of exactly how Jesus Christ was present in the Eucharist differed from that of the Archbishop of Canterbury, you would lose your head. That seemed a little extreme, and I tend to agree with that.
Are the trends you spoke of away from all accounts of Jesus' sacrifice and death a type of Gnosticism, or a move in that direction?
These are great questions. I wish I were up to them. Gnosticism is one of those words that theologians sometimes call a garbage can term because you can put anything into it. Let me take it in one of its senses, and that is the idea that that things physical are repudiated in favor of things mental, that the real action is in the world of ideas, and that ideas like the incarnation or the reality of pain and suffering and the full humanity of Jesus are not valued. I think that's a perennial danger for the church, as are other ideas that we label heresy, or at least heterodoxical. But I think it's more a reaction to the scary amount of violence in our culture, and not wanting to be complicit in that. The movies that we show ourselves, Hollywood gives us what we want, right? Isn't that how it works? So as a culture, we are a violent people, and we're making very loud noises about North Korea. I feel like we did that once. We had a Korean War once. Can we do something else this time? Some of this is generational. I grew up in the Vietnam War era. I was married to a Vietnam War veteran who really didn't make it back. I'm convinced that the costs of war are a lot higher than are usually counted in terms of real damage done to people's psyche. And we consistently underestimate the amount of damage that war does to people, and are unwilling to see it and to pay our share of the costs. I think we need to figure out how some ways in which we can teach ourselves another way.
Thank you.